In May 1967, just before the start of the Arab-Israel War, the Soviet Union had given a classified intelligence report to the then Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. This was about a massive buildup of Israeli troops at the Golan Heights as well as at the Sinai Peninsula. Nasser sent his top army general to verify if there was any truth to this buildup. Turns out there was not a massive buildup like the Russian intelligence report had warned. But Nasser took that as a sign that Russia was willing to back the Arab countries if it came down to a war against Israel. After all, the Soviet Union and the United States were at loggerheads supporting opposite parties in the Middle East conflict. So Gamal Abdel Nasser then ordered the closure of the Tiran Straits. That closure was viewed as an act of war by Israel. And for the next 6 days, starting from the 5th of June, Israel undertook a major offensive against Egypt and Syria. The Arab countries badly lost what came to be known as the Six-Day War. There is a lesson in that history for ties even today between Russia, Israel, and the Arab world. More than 50 years later, that lesson is still very much valid. And that is what we'll explore on Crux Decode. In recent months, Russia-Israel ties have drastically been affected by Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. There have been a flurry of accusations and counter-accusations. Now, back in April, Israel condemned Russia's war, calling it a flagrant violation of the international order. It also voted for the suspension of Moscow from the United Nations Human Rights Council. Moscow responded angrily by labeling Israel's statements as anti-Russian. It also claimed that Israel is using the invasion of Ukraine to distract from its own conflict with the Palestinians. Moscow also condemned Israel for its occupation of the West Bank and the blockade of the Gaza Strip. Sharply deteriorating ties between Moscow and Tel Aviv finally hit rock bottom after the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov recently made a dramatic declaration that Hitler had Jewish blood. Now, this was in response to a question as to why Russia was insisting that Ukraine needed to be denazified if the country's own president, Vladimir Zelensky, was Jewish. The Russian Foreign Ministry also accused Israeli mercenaries of fighting in Ukraine side by side with the notorious Azov battalion. What is behind Hamas and Moscow's recent rapprochement? Now, back in May, a senior Hamas delegation visited Russia, led by the head of the International Relations Office, Musa Abu Marzouk. The intensification of Russia-Hamas ties could be interpreted as a move by Moscow to boost ties with Israel's enemies as a retaliation for Tel Aviv's stand about the war in Ukraine. Palestinian factions, including Hamas, have also long desired a greater engagement with Russia. Their hope is that Moscow could ultimately challenge America's hegemony in the region. Now, Russia does not recognize Hamas as a terrorist group, and in fact, both Moscow and Gaza have had a political relationship for a number of years now. Russia formally accepted Hamas's victory in the 2006 Palestinian elections. Both sides have regularly met since then, most often at the level of ministers or deputy ministers. Moscow reaching out to Hamas is in line with its threats to all those countries who seek to interfere in Russia's war against Ukraine. This is also more a signal to Israel than anything else. Israel has been pressured by America into supplying more heavy weapons to Ukraine. This is Russia's way of trying to deter Israel from doing that. Now remember, early on in this conflict, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett was one of the few Western leaders to meet with both President Putin and President Zelensky. In fact, a week prior to the Hamas visit, Israel had sent the head of its political military bureau to the Ramstein airbase in Germany to discuss sending more weapons to Ukraine. Hamas, for its part, is also facing internal pressures on a lack of progress on key issues with Israel, including extending the ceasefire. Most Muslim countries, from the UAE to Saudi Arabia, and now even Turkey, are rebalancing their relationship with Israel, making it more normalized. But there is a third complication. Russia is long involved in the conflict in Syria. There's been a lot of speculation about backroom deals and negotiations between Israel and Russia, and even tacit support between Israel and Russia for going after Hezbollah-backed rebels in Syria. Now, those same rebels pose a serious threat to Israel. Russia has many channels through local actors in Syria as well as in Iran to provide support without direct involvement. And if Tel Aviv now and Moscow were to be daggers drawn, Israel will have to contend with new security challenges in the region, exemplified, of course, both by Syria and Iran. In the context of an emerging new Cold War between Russia and the United States, it is most likely that both powers will confront each other in ways that could bring greater instability to the Middle East. Russia-US tensions will continue to spill out onto other proxy wars. There is the proxy war that's happening in Syria. There's also the war in Yemen and the fallout of it between Houthi rebels and the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. All of this will have a bearing on Israel's security. There is also a great game going on in Africa between the US, China, and Russia over the continent's natural resources. There could also be repercussions in Venezuela and in Cuba if Russia seeks to intervene in what's perceived as America's backyard. Since the United States shifted away from the global war on terror, combating Russian and Chinese influence has been its top priority. That makes continued proxy wars with Russia all but inevitable.